Hello and welcome to your ultimate guide for the C464 OA, Introduction to Communication course. My goal today is simple: give you everything you need to fully understand the key concepts, master them, and walk into your C464 OA exam with total confidence. In this video we'll cover defining communication, communication challenges, linear model, interactional model, and transactional model. And remember, our website offers free exam guides and practice questions to help you ace your C464 OA exam. You'll find the link in the description below, so be sure to check it out and get the resources you need to study smarter, not harder. So let's dive right in. Let's start with a question that might seem simple but is actually quite profound. Why should you study communication at all? You might think communication is just common sense. You talk, people listen, they respond, and that's it. But here's the truth. Communication is one of the most complex human activities, and most people are not naturally good at it. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you been misunderstood? How many times have you misunderstood someone else? How many conflicts in your relationships, whether personal or professional, stem from poor communication? The answer is probably more than you'd like to admit. This is exactly why studying communication matters. Research shows that communication skills are the #1 predictor of career success. Employers consistently rank communication as the most important skill they look for in candidates. It doesn't matter if you're an engineer, a doctor, a teacher, or an entrepreneur. Your ability to communicate effectively will determine how far you go in your career and how successful you become. But communication isn't just important for career success. It's essential for building and maintaining relationships, for resolving conflicts, for persuading others, for learning new information, and for expressing yourself authentically. Every single day of your life involves communication in some form. Learning to do it well is one of the most valuable investments you can make. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. What exactly is communication? At its most basic level, communication is the exchange of verbal and non-verbal messages between people. But this simple definition doesn't capture the full complexity of what's really happening when we communicate. Communication is fundamentally about creating and sharing meaning. When you communicate, you're not just transmitting information like a radio signal. You're engaging in a complex process of encoding your thoughts and feelings into symbols, primarily words and gestures, and then sharing those symbols with another person. That person then has to decode those symbols and try to understand what you meant. This entire process is fraught with opportunities for misunderstanding. Here's what makes communication so challenging. The meaning of your message doesn't exist in the words themselves. Meaning exists in people's minds. The same words can mean completely different things to different people, based on their experiences, their culture, their current emotional state, and countless other factors. This is why two people can have the same conversation but walk away with completely different understandings. Let's talk about what successful communication actually means. Successful communication occurs when the receiver understands the message in the way the sender intended it. Notice that this is a pretty high bar to clear. It's not enough for the receiver to just hear your words or even to respond. They have to actually understand what you meant, which requires both clarity on your part and effort on their part. Unsuccessful communication happens when there's a gap between what you meant and what the other person understood. This happens all the time, often without either person realizing it. You might walk away from a conversation thinking you were perfectly clear, while the other person has a completely different understanding of what was discussed. These misunderstandings can lead to serious problems in both personal and professional contexts. Now, I want to address a common misconception that trips up a lot of people. Many people believe that communication is just common sense. They think that because they've been communicating since they were babies, they don't need to study it or work on improving it. This belief is not only wrong, it's actually harmful because it prevents people from developing better skills. The truth is that communication is a learned skill, not an innate ability. Yes, humans have a biological capacity for language and social interaction, but being an effective communicator requires knowledge, practice, and ongoing refinement. Just like you wouldn't expect to be good at playing piano or speaking a foreign language without study and practice, you can't expect to be an excellent communicator without deliberately working on it. Think about children learning to communicate. They start with crying and simple sounds. Over years, they learn vocabulary, grammar, social rules, and cultural norms. But even as adults, most people have significant room for improvement in their communication skills. The difference between average communicators and excellent communicators is usually education and practice, not natural talent. The evidence for communication's importance is overwhelming. Studies of organizational effectiveness consistently show that communication problems are among the top reasons for project failures, employee dissatisfaction, and customer complaints. In contrast, organizations with strong communication cultures are more innovative, more productive, and more profitable. The same patterns hold true in personal relationships. Research on career advancement reveals that technical skills might get you hired, but communication skills determine whether you get promoted. Leaders spend the majority of their time communicating, whether through meetings, emails, presentations, or one-on-one conversations. Your ability to communicate your ideas clearly, to listen effectively, to resolve conflicts, and to inspire others will have a direct impact on your career trajectory. Now that we understand why communication matters, let's explore the major challenges you'll face when trying to communicate effectively. Understanding these challenges is crucial because they explain why good communication is so difficult and why so many communication attempts fail. There are 4 primary challenges that every communicator must navigate. The first major challenge is that communication requires significant intellectual and psychological resources. Let me break down what this really means. When you communicate, you're not just opening your mouth and letting words fall out. You're engaging in a complex cognitive process that demands substantial mental energy and emotional capacity. Think about what's actually involved in sending a message. First, you have to plan what you want to say. This means organizing your thoughts, choosing the right words, considering your audience, and structuring your message for maximum clarity and impact. This planning phase alone requires significant cognitive effort, especially for complex or sensitive topics. Next, you have to encode your message. This means translating your internal thoughts and feelings into symbols that others can understand. You're making countless decisions about word choice, tone, emphasis, and structure. Every single word you choose carries connotations and implications that affect how your message will be received. This encoding process happens incredibly fast, but it's remarkably complex. Then you have to deliver your message. This involves not just speaking the words, but also managing your nonverbal communication. Your facial expressions, your body language, your tone of voice, your gestures, all of these elements communicate meaning alongside your words. Coordinating all of these channels of communication simultaneously requires significant mental processing power. But the cognitive demands don't stop there. While you're delivering your message, you also have to read feedback from your audience. Are they understanding you? Do they look confused? Are they engaged or bored? Are they agreeing or disagreeing? You're constantly processing these signals and adjusting your communication in real time based on what you observe. After the interaction, you engage in reflection and evaluation. You think about how the conversation went. Did you achieve your communication goals? Could you have said something differently? What did you learn about the other person? This post-interaction processing helps you improve your future communication, but also requires mental resources. On top of all these cognitive demands, communication also carries significant psychological weight. Every interaction is colored by emotional baggage. Your past experiences with communication, your fears about being misunderstood or rejected, your relationship history with the other person, your current emotional state. All of these factors influence how you communicate and how you interpret others' communication. Consider a simple example. If you've been criticized harshly in the past, you might be defensive when receiving feedback, even if the feedback is constructive and well-intentioned. If you've been lied to before, you might be suspicious of others' motives, even when they're being genuine. These emotional factors can interfere with clear communication in powerful ways. The psychological resources required for communication are especially evident in difficult conversations. When you need to give negative feedback, resolve a conflict, discuss a sensitive topic, or communicate under stress, the emotional demands intensify dramatically. This is why people often avoid these conversations or handle them poorly. The psychological resources required feel overwhelming. Understanding this first challenge helps you appreciate why good communication is so tiring and why it requires deliberate effort and practice. You can't communicate on autopilot and expect good results. You need to invest the intellectual and psychological resources necessary for effective communication. This is a skill that improves with practice, but always requires genuine effort. The second major challenge is that not everyone values communication equally. This might seem obvious, but it creates significant problems in relationships and organizations. People have different communication philosophies, different beliefs about how much effort communication deserves, and different expectations about what constitutes good communication. Some people believe that communication is critically important and worth significant time and effort. They prioritize clear, direct, thoughtful communication. They're willing to have difficult conversations. They invest in developing their communication skills. They see communication as a foundational element of success and healthy relationships. Other people view communication more casually. They might think that communication should be easy and natural. They might avoid difficult conversations or uncomfortable topics. They might not invest much energy in being clear or in understanding others deeply. They might believe that if you have to work hard at communication, something is wrong with the relationship. These different philosophies create mismatched expectations. Imagine a relationship where one person values deep, frequent communication, while the other person prefers minimal communication and assumes that if things are going well, there's no need to talk much. This mismatch can lead to frustration on both sides. One person feels neglected and disconnected. The other person feels pressured and exhausted. In professional settings, these differences in communication values can cause serious problems. Some team members might expect regular updates, detailed explanations, and open dialogue. Others might view excessive communication as inefficient or unnecessary. Some leaders might prioritize transparency and frequent communication with their teams. Others might take a more hands-off approach, believing that too much communication creates confusion. There's no universally right answer about how much communication is appropriate. Different situations call for different approaches, but problems arise when people don't recognize and address these differences in values and expectations. The key is to make communication preferences explicit and to negotiate an approach that works for everyone involved. On your exam, you might be asked to identify scenarios where mismatched communication values create problems or to suggest solutions for bridging these gaps. The important thing to remember is that recognizing these differences is the first step toward resolving communication challenges related to varying levels of commitment to communication itself. The third major challenge is digital communication over-reliance. This is a relatively recent challenge, but an increasingly important one. As more of our communication moves online, through text messages, emails, social media, and video calls, we're losing opportunities to develop and practice face-to-face communication skills. Digital communication has many advantages. It's fast, convenient, and allows us to stay connected across distances. But it also has significant limitations. Most digital communication lacks the rich, nonverbal cues that are present in face-to-face interaction. You can't see body language in a text message. You can't hear tone of voice in an email. Even video calls don't fully capture the subtle nonverbal signals that we exchange in person. As people rely more heavily on digital communication, their ability to read and interpret nonverbal cues diminishes. They become less skilled at understanding facial expressions, at picking up on subtle emotional signals, at adjusting their communication based on real-time feedback. These skills require practice, and if you're primarily communicating through text, you're not getting that practice. There's also a tendency to use technology as a crutch rather than as a tool. Some people hide behind digital communication to avoid difficult conversations. It's easier to send a harsh email than to deliver criticism face-to-face. It's easier to break up with someone via text message than in person. But these choices often make the communication less effective and can damage relationships. The challenge is to use digital communication appropriately without letting it replace face-to-face interaction entirely. There are situations where digital communication is perfect. There are other situations where face-to-face communication is essential. Effective communicators know the difference and choose the right channel for each message. On your exam, you might encounter questions about the advantages and disadvantages of different communication channels, or about when to use digital versus face-to-face communication. The key principle is that richer, more complex or more sensitive messages generally require richer communication channels with more cues available. The fourth major challenge is cultural diversity and intercultural understanding. As our world becomes more connected, we increasingly communicate with people from different cultural backgrounds. Different cultures have different communication norms, different expectations, different interpretations of verbal and nonverbal behaviour. These differences create opportunities for misunderstanding and miscommunication. Consider something as simple as eye contact. In some cultures, direct eye contact is a sign of honesty, confidence, and respect. In other cultures, direct eye contact can be seen as aggressive, disrespectful, or inappropriate, especially when communicating with someone of higher status. If you're not aware of these cultural differences, you might misinterpret someone's behaviour or inadvertently offend them. Communication styles also vary across cultures. Some cultures value direct, explicit communication, where people say exactly what they mean. Other cultures prefer indirect communication, where meaning is conveyed through context, implication, and subtle cues. Neither style is better or worse, but when people from these different styles interact, misunderstandings are common. Cultural differences also affect how people handle conflict, how they make decisions, how they view time, how they define politeness, and countless other aspects of communication. Without cultural sensitivity and awareness, you can easily make mistakes that damage relationships or create communication barriers. The challenge is to develop cultural competence. This means learning about different cultural communication norms, remaining curious and open-minded, avoiding assumptions, asking questions when you're unsure, and adapting your communication style when necessary. It also means recognizing your own cultural biases and how they influence your communication and interpretation. For your exam, be prepared to identify how cultural differences might affect communication and to suggest strategies for improving intercultural communication. The key principles are awareness, respect, flexibility, and a willingness to learn from others whose communication norms differ from your own. Now let's shift our focus to communication models. Models are simplified representations of complex processes. They help us understand what's happening during communication and diagnose where problems might occur. Communication scholars have developed several models over time, each one building on and improving previous versions. Understanding these models is crucial for your exam. The earliest and simplest model is the linear model, also known as the Shannon-Weaver model. This model was developed in the 1940s by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver, who were actually engineers working on telephone technology, not communication scholars. Their goal was to improve the technical transmission of messages, but their model was later applied to human communication. The linear model conceptualizes communication as a one-way transmission process. It has 5 basic components. First, there's a sender, the person who originates the message. Second, there's a message, the information being communicated. Third, there's a channel, the medium through which the message travels. Fourth, there's a receiver, the person who receives the message. And fifth, there's noise, which is any interference that distorts or blocks the message. Let's walk through an example. Imagine you're giving a presentation to your class. You are the sender. Your lecture content is the message. The air through which sound waves travel is the channel. Your classmates are the receivers. And noise might include external factors like a loud air conditioner, someone's phone ringing, or a fire alarm going off. It might also include internal factors like a student daydreaming or feeling ill. The linear model is useful because it identifies the basic elements present in any communication situation. It also highlights the importance of noise as a factor that can interfere with message transmission. In practical terms, this model reminds us to minimize distractions and interference when we want communication to be effective. However, the linear model has significant limitations. The biggest problem is that it portrays communication as a one-way process. The sender sends, the receiver receives, and that's it. There's no feedback, no interaction, no back and forth exchange. This doesn't accurately represent how human communication actually works. In real communication, receivers respond to messages. They ask questions, they nod their heads. They look confused, they interrupt, they agree or disagree. Communication is interactive, not just transmissive. The linear model fails to capture this interactive quality. It treats people like machines, with one machine sending signals and another machine receiving them. Another limitation is that the linear model suggests that communication is primarily about information transfer. But as we discussed earlier, communication is really about creating shared meaning. It's not just about moving information from one head to another. It's about negotiating understanding, building relationships, and coordinating action. The linear model oversimplifies this complex process. Despite these limitations, the linear model is still valuable as a starting point. It gives us vocabulary for discussing communication. It identifies key elements that we need to consider, and it highlights the importance of clarity and reducing interference. But to truly understand communication, we need more sophisticated models. This brings us to the Interactional Model of communication. This model emerged in the 1950s and 60s as scholars recognized the limitations of the linear model. The interactional model adds a crucial element that was missing before: feedback loops. This makes communication a two-way process rather than a one-way transmission. In the interactional model, communication is still somewhat linear, but now it goes in both directions. The sender sends a message to the receiver then provides feedback to the sender. This feedback can take many forms: verbal responses, questions, nodding, facial expressions, or any other signal that indicates how the message was received. The sender then adjusts their next message based on this feedback. The interactional model recognizes that the roles of sender and receiver alternate. Sometimes you're speaking and the other person is listening. Then the roles reverse. You're listening and the other person is speaking. Communication is seen as a series of exchanges rather than a single transmission. This is much closer to how actual conversations work. Let's revisit our classroom presentation example using the interactional model. You're presenting to your class. As you speak, you notice that some students look confused. This is feedback. Based on this feedback, you might slow down, rephrase your explanation, or ask if anyone has questions. A student raises their hand and asks for clarification. Now the student has temporarily become the sender, and you've become the receiver. You answer the question, shifting roles again. The interactional model also introduces the concept of context. Communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. It occurs within physical, social, psychological, and cultural contexts that influence how messages are created and interpreted. The interactional model acknowledges that these contextual factors matter and affect the communication process. However, the interactional model still has limitations. While it recognizes feedback and role switching, it still portrays communication as somewhat mechanical. It suggests that communication happens in a back and forth sequence, where one person sends while the other receives, then they switch. But in reality, communication is even more dynamic than this. People are sending and receiving simultaneously, not just in alternating turns. Think about a face-to-face conversation. While you're speaking, you're also observing the other person's nonverbal reactions. You're receiving feedback continuously, not just when they take their turn to speak. And while they're listening, they're also sending messages through their facial expressions and body language. Communication is truly simultaneous and multidirectional, not just sequential and bidirectional. This realization led to the development of the most sophisticated and accurate model, the Transactional Model of communication. This model represents our current best understanding of how communication actually works. It's the model you need to know thoroughly for your exam because it captures the full complexity of the communication process. The Transactional Model views communication as a simultaneous, ongoing process where all participants are constantly sending and receiving messages at the same time. There are no senders and receivers, only communicators. Everyone involved in communication is both sending and receiving continuously throughout the interaction. This simultaneous exchange is what makes communication truly transactional. In the transactional model, communication is dynamic and constantly evolving. Each message builds on previous messages and influences subsequent messages. The meaning that emerges is co-created by all participants rather than simply transmitted from one person to another. Communication is seen as a process, not an event, something that unfolds over time and changes as it progresses. Let's explore the key components of the transactional model in detail. First, there are communicators rather than separate senders and receivers. Each person is simultaneously encoding and decoding messages. You're expressing yourself while also interpreting the other person's expressions. You're sending nonverbal signals while also reading theirs. This happens all at once, continuously. Second, there are messages. In the transactional model, messages aren't just the words spoken. They include all verbal and nonverbal signals that carry meaning. Your words, your tone, your facial expressions, your gestures, your posture, your appearance, all of these elements constitute messages. And these messages are being exchanged simultaneously by all communicators. Third, there's noise. Just like in earlier models, noise is any interference that affects the communication process. But in the transactional model, we recognize that noise operates at multiple levels. There's external noise, environmental factors like sounds, visual distractions, or physical discomfort. There's physiological noise, biological factors like hunger, fatigue, or illness that affect communication. There's also psychological noise, mental and emotional factors like stress, preoccupation, biases, or strong emotions. And there's semantic noise, problems with language such as jargon, unclear terms, or cultural differences in word meanings. Effective communicators try to minimize all forms of noise and compensate for noise that can't be eliminated. Fourth, there's context. Communication always occurs within contexts that shape its meaning. Physical context includes the environment where communication takes place. The same conversation will feel different in a formal office versus a casual coffee shop. Social context includes the relationships and roles of the communicators. You communicate differently with your boss than with your best friend. Cultural context includes the broader cultural norms and values that influence communication. Your culture shapes what you consider polite, appropriate, and meaningful. Historical context includes the shared history between communicators and the broader historical moment. Your previous interactions with someone influence your current communication. Temporal context includes time-related factors such as time of day, amount of time available, or whether this is your first conversation or your 100th. Fifth, there's the concept of fields of experience. This refers to all the factors that influence how you interpret messages, your education, your upbringing, your culture, your personal experiences, your values, your beliefs, everything that makes you who you are. Effective communication requires overlap between communicators' fields of experience. The more you have in common, the easier it is to create shared meaning. When fields of experience don't overlap much, communication becomes more challenging. You have to work harder to establish common ground and to understand each other's perspectives. This is why communicating across significant cultural, generational, or experiential differences requires extra effort and patience. Let's look at a real-world example using the transactional model. Imagine you're having a serious conversation with a friend about a problem in your relationship. You're both communicators. As you speak, you're also watching your friend's reactions, adjusting your message based on their facial expressions. Your friend is nodding, looking concerned, occasionally interjecting words of support. Both of you are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. The messages include your words, your tone of voice, your facial expressions, your body language, even the timing and pacing of your speech. Noise might include your anxiety about the conversation, your friend's worry about saying the wrong thing, external sounds from traffic or other people, or semantic confusion if you use words differently than your friend understands them. The context includes the physical setting, where you're talking, your friendship history, your cultural backgrounds, and the broader social context of how people in your culture typically handle these conversations. Your fields of experience overlap significantly since you're friends, which helps. But you also have differences in perspective based on your individual experiences and personalities. Throughout the conversation, meaning is being co-created. It's not that you have a message and you're trying to transfer it to your friend's brain. Instead, both of you are working together to create understanding. Your friend asks questions that help you clarify your thoughts. You respond to their reactions by emphasizing certain points. The understanding that emerges is a joint creation, not a one-way transmission. This transactional model is the most accurate representation of how communication actually works. It accounts for the complexity, the simultaneity, the dynamic nature, and the collaborative aspects of communication. For your exam, you need to be able to identify all the components of this model and apply it to analyze real communication situations. Let's compare the three models to solidify your understanding. The linear model sees communication as one-way transmission. The interactional model sees communication as two-way exchange with feedback. The transactional model sees communication as simultaneous, multi-directional co-creation of meaning. Each model builds on the previous one, adding sophistication and accuracy. You can use these models to diagnose communication problems. If noise is interfering with message reception, that's a linear model problem. Reduce the noise or change the channel. If feedback isn't being sought or incorporated, that's an interactional model problem. Pay more attention to the other person's responses and adjust accordingly. If there's insufficient overlap in fields of experience, or if context isn't being considered, that's a transactional model problem. Spend time establishing common ground. Be aware of how context shapes meaning. Remember that communication is collaborative. Both parties need to work together to create shared understanding. For your exam, you might be given a scenario and asked to identify which model best describes the situation, or to use a model to explain where communication broke down. You might need to recommend improvements based on model principles. The key is understanding what each model emphasizes and what its limitations are. Let me give you some exam-specific guidance. First, know the components of each model cold. Be able to list and define them. Second, understand the historical progression from linear to interactional to transactional. This shows how our understanding of communication has evolved. Third, be able to apply models to real situations and explain what's happening from each model's perspective. Fourth, recognize that while the transactional model is most accurate, each model has value. Sometimes a simpler model is useful for analyzing a particular aspect of communication. Fifth, practice identifying types of noise in scenarios. Physical, physiological, psychological, and semantic noise are all important concepts that often appear on exams. Sixth, be comfortable discussing context and how it influences communication. You should be able to identify different types of context and explain their impact. Seventh, understand fields of experience and why overlap matters. This concept helps explain why communication across differences is challenging and what can be done to improve it. Now let's tie everything together. We started by exploring why communication matters. It's essential for career success, relationships, and personal effectiveness. We learned that communication is not common sense, but a learned skill that requires study and practice. We examined the four major challenges of communication: the resource demands, differing values, digital over-reliance, and cultural complexity. We then explored three communication models that help us understand the communication process. The linear model introduced basic components and the concept of noise. The interactional model added feedback and context. The transactional model revealed communication as simultaneous, dynamic co-creation of meaning. Each model offers insights for improving communication effectiveness. As you prepare for your exam, focus on understanding these foundational concepts deeply rather than just memorizing definitions. Think about how they apply to your own communication experiences. Consider how you might use this knowledge to communicate more effectively. The concepts we've covered form the foundation for everything else you'll learn about communication. Remember that communication is central to almost everything humans do together. Whether you're working on a team, building a relationship, resolving a conflict, teaching, learning, leading, or following. Communication is the medium through which it all happens. Investing in your communication skills is investing in your future success and well-being. For your exam, be prepared to define key terms, explain concepts, apply models to scenarios, identify challenges in communication situations, and recommend solutions based on communication principles. The material we've covered today forms the core foundation that all other communication topics build upon. Master these basics, and you'll be well positioned for success. I encourage you to review this material multiple times. Each time you review, you'll notice new connections and develop deeper understanding. Test yourself by creating your own examples of each concept. Explain the models to someone else. Teaching is one of the best ways to solidify your learning and identify gaps in your understanding. As you continue studying, pay attention to communication in your daily life. Notice when communication is effective and when it breaks down. Try to identify which model best explains what's happening. Recognize the challenges people face and think about solutions. This real-world practice will help you internalize the concepts and perform better on your exam. You now have a solid foundation in the basics of communication. You understand what communication is, why it matters, what makes it challenging, and how models help us understand the process. You're ready to build on this foundation with more advanced concepts. Keep studying, keep practicing, and you'll develop the communication competence that will serve you throughout your life. Thank you for watching this comprehensive guide. I believe in your ability to master this material and excel on your exam. The time you've invested in understanding these foundational concepts will pay dividends not just on the test, but in every area of your life where communication matters. Good luck with your studies and your exam.